It's the coalition government's first budget, and education, like most of the rest of the public sector, is facing severe cuts. So what exactly does it mean for teachers as the cash gets tighter and as the government looks for new ways of channeling funds to schools?
Well, if we're talking about 25% real terms cut in the budget for the department, then there's no way that you can make those kinds of cuts without affecting schools.
How do you fund a pupil premium, which is going to be hugely expensive, is a question which hasn't yet been answered.
Even before the Chancellor appeared outside number 11 Downing Street to present his red box to the media, we'd learned that, for this year at least, school budgets had escaped unscathed from the coalition government's immediate post-election cuts. But several other areas of education spending, which indirectly affect schools, had been cut. Altogether, education's share of the first round of cuts was £670 million. Grants to local authorities were reduced, affecting areas like school meals and training for school support staff. The education spending cuts included £80 million from the budgets of education quangos. Education for 14 to 19-year-olds was cut by almost £60 million, including reduced support for diplomas. Cancelling the Rose Primary Curriculum Review saved £7 million, and removing funding for the next round of high-performing specialist schools saved a further £7 million. But the biggest cuts were reserved for later, when George Osborne announced his austerity budget.
Chancellor, how much is it going to hurt?
The Chancellor said there would be a 2-year pay freeze for all public sector workers, although initially teachers remain unaffected until September 2011, when the final stage of the Pay Review Body Award runs out. The Chancellor also said that apart from the NHS and overseas aid, both of which are protected, all other government departments will face a real terms cut averaging 25% over the next 4 years. However, he added that not all departments would be cut by this amount, with some hit harder and others receiving lower than average cuts. Specifically, he said, he recognised the particular pressures on both education and defence. But even if education's cut is less than 25%, the consequences will still be serious.
Even a cut of 10% to education spending would be unprecedented in the last 50 years across a 4-year period. The largest cut we've seen to education spending in the last 50 years was about 5% after the IMF proposals in the 1970s. So a 10% cut would be double the largest cut in the last 50 years.
Well, if we're talking about 25% real terms cut in the budget for the DCS, for the department, then there's no way that you can make those kinds of cuts without affecting schools.
And if you're having to make reductions in an individual school's budget, can you do that without affecting jobs and pay?
We'd always been in favour of cutting waste and inefficiency, but if you're making cuts of that level, then you're talking about staffing. You know, in a school, your budget, you spend probably 80% of your budget on staffing costs. And if you're going to make cuts of any significance, you aren't going to do it by fiddling around with the electricity bill. You're going to have to look at your staffing.
A substantial amount of government funding in recent years has gone into the Building Schools for the Future programme, which provides capital funding for the construction and refurbishment of buildings. But the Labour government had already announced plans to cut overall public sector capital spending by 50% over the next 5 years. Although no further cuts were announced in the budget, officials in the Department for Education are now taking a detailed look at these capital programmes. An announcement is imminent. So, with the government facing hard economic choices, are there any areas where funding might increase rather than decrease? The Education Secretary Michael Gove has said one area where he wants to spend more rather than less is on pupils from poorer backgrounds. So he will go ahead with the pupil premium, which was promised in both the Conservative and the Liberal Democrat manifestos. And he said it will be funded by extra money taken from outside the education budget.
As with so many things, the devil's in the detail. We know that we're entering a period where this public spending is not just going to be tight, it's going to be strangled. They say that schools are going to be protected. Well, we'd have to see what that actually means. And how do you fund a pupil premium, which is going to be hugely expensive, is a question which hasn't yet been answered.
Bishop Challoner School in the borough of Tower Hamlets in London serves an area with high levels of deprivation. Over 30% of its pupils are on free school meals, and it might expect to gain from a pupil premium. Head teacher Catherine Myers has seen a significant rise in standards here. In 1992, only 18% of pupils got 5A stars to C. Now that figure is over 90%.
Many of the children are living under the poverty line, and it's the school that makes a difference. We become more than just teachers, but we're also doing part of the parenting and raising aspirations.
How might a pupil premium help a school like Bishop Challoner? And how would it differ from existing funding? The Institute for Fiscal Studies, an independent think tank which specialises in finance, has attempted to answer these questions.
Local authorities do already provide a substantial amount of money towards schools with great numbers of deprived pupils. On average, they provide about £2,000 to £3,000 for each pupil eligible for free school meals. However, different local authorities do it in very different ways. It can be very complicated in some local authorities and some simpler in other local authorities. So the proposals for a pupil premium would essentially harmonise that process across all local authorities and would simplify it, and could, if they choose to provide extra money, make it more generous.
Deprived pupils already attract on average £2,000 to £3,000 extra. How much difference would a pupil premium make?
It would depend on whether the pupil premium is on top or replacing current deprivation funding. So if it's on top, it would clearly be additional. If it was replacing, then they'd have to make sure that the pupil premium was as generous or more generous than current deprivation funding.
So what level of pupil premium would it require to make a difference at Bishop Challoner? And how might the school use that extra money?
If the pupil premium was £2,500 for every deprived child, it would raise standards in the schools. It would mean more opportunities for young people, more personalised learning, more trips to widen their educational participation and therefore raise standards and create opportunities for them when they leave school.
The pupil premium could be a first step towards a more fundamental change in school funding. The government has spoken of its wish to move eventually to a national funding formula. This would be a major change from the historic way of funding local authority schools, in which the final amount spent per pupil is decided locally.
Currently, the money from the centre goes to the local authority, and the local authority decides how much it has to spend on youngsters not in maintained schools. Since there are 153 local authorities, there are 153 different formulae for allocating the money to schools.
And a national funding formula, there would be just one formula for how that money would be distributed.
Yes.
In the current system, the overall school's budget comprises the money left in the education department after deductions for central costs and other areas like nursery education. About 70% then goes as dedicated schools grant to local authorities, with the rest spent on school buildings, sixth forms and academies. Currently, the local authority keeps some back for central services such as special needs and pupil referral units, and distributes the rest to schools according to locally set formulae. Under a national funding formula, central government would distribute money directly to schools according to a single formula weighted for pupil deprivation, special needs and other factors.
You'd have a basic entitlement per student, which would probably differ according to the age of the youngster. And then on top of that, you would have additional money for youngsters who need extra support. And almost certainly you would also have to have some way of allowing for the fact that in different parts of the country, some parts of the country, it costs more to run an education system.
So even with a national funding formula, that doesn't mean that every pupil in every school in every part of the country will get the same amount of money. That is not the case.
No, that would definitely not be the case, because we fund according to need in this country, and that's a very sort of fundamental belief in this education system.
It's fair to say that funding's complicated, but education's a complicated business because people have different needs, and it's a question of trying to be fair to the people who have needs, and while understanding that there is a recession and the money's going to be limited.
Now the budget is over, the next big step is the Comprehensive Spending Review in autumn 2010. That's when the overall spending targets set in the budget will be argued over and negotiated over and turned into specific spending allocations for each government department. Only then will we know exactly what lies in store for schools. In the next episode of Need to Know, I'll be looking at the implications of the June 2010 budget for teachers' pay and conditions and for pensions.
In an environment where they're cutting, ultimately, I think that, within the education system, and I think the head teachers will not be looking to cut teachers initially. They will be looking to make savings elsewhere. I just suppose it depends how long the period of austerity lasts.